Good morning. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Paul Stonehouse. And Paul, I think he contacted me. I can't remember really, but the funniest part about it for me, Paul is a professor at a local college called Green Mountain College, which I happened to go to my freshman year of college. It's now very different. It's he can tell you a little bit more, but it's a college dedicated to sustainability and taking care of the land. And when I went there, it was like a women's finishing school. So I'd much rather go to it now than then. But he told me he wanted to do a presentation on no-trace camping. And I kind of laughed to myself and said, I wonder if he knows what kind of camping we do. And in order for him to understand, I sent him the video that Al made of one of our winter camping trips, and I said, we jokingly call it Leave No Trees. And after watching the video, he was still willing to come and said he thought it would really fit. So I want to welcome Paul Stonehouse.
So as Wendy said, I might be unwise in trying to make a bridge here with some of the maybe poor sentiment towards the Leave No Trace program, but I'm optimistic that we can find some common ground. I'd like to talk just briefly about where I hope we go in roughly the next 20 minutes. This is a bit of a roadmap for us. I'm going to begin with a confession, and then I'd like to talk about the misnomer. You can see that I put no in scare quotes. And I want to talk a little bit about Leave No Trace's philosophy and why they chose that title. I want to suggest that Leave No Trace isn't really about rules in any way. It comes from a deeper place of an ethic. And so I'm challenging myself with that, and then I'd want to put the challenge also to the community about how we could maybe begin to think about lessening the impacts in the places that we love. I want to introduce the organization very briefly. There's much more that can be said that I won't say. And then very briefly, I'd like to introduce the 7 principles and try to make a bridge to how it might be relevant to traditional winter travel. And then just end with a small conclusion. So here's my confession. My winter skills have been trained more in an alpine climbing environment, so I'm relatively new to traditional methods of winter travel. However, I am a wilderness paddler, and so I think a lot of the skill sets that I use, I think, in my understanding, in a Leave No Trace sensitive way, in my wilderness paddling, have a corresponding skill set for the winter. So I'm hoping that we can find a bridge between these two things. So right off the bat, I want to admit that it is a misnomer, and I'm actually significantly good friends with one of the lead educators that works at Leave No Trace. And they talk about it being a very purposeful decision to choose Leave No Trace as their moniker. They batted around all kinds of different verbiage, and they just felt that Leave Less of a Trace was not going to be quite as compelling, and it kind of set the bar kind of low. So they know it was an overstep. They made the decision. Some of them regret it, I think, frankly, because it's turned some folks off. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think there is a lot here, again, that can help us minimize unnecessary impacts on the places that we love. So it's very unfortunate to me that there's been a bit of a tension between more alpine styles of winter camping and the more traditional styles of winter camping. And so you have the alpine folks often criticizing the traditional folks for just the reason that Wendy mentioned, particularly the use of wood for the sake of the superstructures of the tent and then the fuel source for your fires. And at the same time, I think very rightfully so, the traditional folks could be critical of the significant amount of fossil fuels that people wear on their bodies in the more alpine style of climbing. In fact, I think really it would be helpful if we thought of Leave No Trace less as a categorical statement of we're not trying to leave any trace. That's just not possible as our species. But what we could think about is impactful impacts on the natural environment, and then moving towards less impacts, and that being a continuum. And for most of us, certainly me included, with thoughtful practice, we can inch our way towards less impact, particularly the unnecessary. So I want to celebrate the values of this community. I think if you took a true cost accounting and you looked at the fibers that are used for much of the travel, natural fibers such as cotton, that the snowshoes are often wood or babiche, and that if thoughtfully cut, we can selectively log, essentially, and actually increase the health of the forests when done in a mindful manner. So contrary to what you might have expected for someone presenting on Leave No Trace, I would celebrate that this community is probably leaving less of a trace than much of the alpine community in their winter styles. I do want to challenge myself, and I want to challenge the community, that Leave No Trace is not about rules. It ultimately, I think, at its source is an ethic, and you see this in the official title of the Leave No Trace Incorporation. The full title, which is really unfortunate to me that it doesn't get mentioned very often, is the Leave No Trace, yes, but Center for Outdoor Ethics. And it ultimately is an ethic that the curriculum is trying to appeal to. And I don't think it's going to be a very difficult sell with this crowd. Some of our forefathers, if you will, have very clearly and unapologizingly spoken of their love of the land. And I think for most of us, it ultimately is about a deep care, compassion, and love for the landscapes that we try to pursue our activities in the north. Many of you will be familiar with Sigurd Olsen. This quote is taken from a chapter called A Love of the Land, and it's from Reflections from the North Country. Without love of the land, conservation lacks meaning and purpose. For only in a deep and inherent feeling for the land can there be dedication in preserving it. And another patron saint of ecology here, Sand County Almanac, the extended chapter called The Land Ethic. Leopold also speaks about a love relationship with the land. It is inconceivable to me that an ethical relation to land can exist without love, respect, and admiration for land, and a high regard for its value. And so I want to, again, challenge us that I think this is not about stuff we have to do, but stuff we get to do, and it's motivated not out of a duty or an obligation or even grudgingly, but something that we lovingly do for the respect of the other species that we join in these winter environments and the inanimate nature that we enjoy as well. So very briefly, just a little bit about the organization. The organization really came about because of the growing field of recreational ecology. So this is a scientific field where scientists are trying to measure impacts, both biological and social. So the biological impacts that they're trying to discover would be the impacts on soil, the impacts on vegetation, and the impacts on water for wilderness travel. The social impacts that they're trying to examine are not just the impact of us seeing other members of our species out and how many people we can see before it starts to detract from our wilderness experience, but in particular our impact on the other species, not our own, that we impact when we're out on backcountry travel. This book is a recent publication by a recreational ecologist, Jeff Marion. I think it's a 2014. If you're interested more and want a bit more of a broader perspective on this topic, this would be a helpful read. So as a result of the recreational ecology research, scientists came up with 7 general principles that non-scientists could intuit that would help us move towards lessening unnecessary impacts in both backcountry environments, but also front country, which is where a majority of the impact happens, that is, wilder places that are still close to home, well within a day's drive. And so you can't, I'm afraid, quite read some of those. I'll maybe just read through them so you can become a little more familiar. But plan ahead and prepare, travel and camp on durable surfaces, dispose of waste properly, leave what you find, minimize campfire impacts, respect wildlife, and be considerate of other visitors. So again, I'm trying to emphasize that these are principles, they're not rules, and that simply what we're trying to do by being aware and conscious of these scientifically informed principles is simply move towards the right end of the continuum here. We're just trying to, where we can and where it's appropriate for our style of travel, lessen unnecessary impacts on the places that we love. The organization was established in 1994, although there had been a no-trace curriculum long before that. This is the mission of Leave No Trace: to protect the outdoors by teaching and inspiring people to enjoy it responsibly. There's a 3-tier educational program and curriculum within Leave No Trace. A master educator teaches the trainer course. The master educator course is usually a minimum of 5 days. 4 of those nights would be spent in a backcountry setting practicing the principles. It's both the curriculum and the content, if you will, with the 7 principles, but a large part of the master educator course is actually learning how to communicate those to the general public. Trainer courses, there'd be far more people that have experienced the trainer course than there would be master educator, but the master educators in the country, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia all have Leave No Trace programs. Master educators worldwide are beginning to grow in numbers. In fact, I think we've got one in the audience today. And then the last one is something that you're essentially experiencing right now, which is an awareness workshop, which is usually 20 to 30 minutes or up to an hour. One notable thing about the Leave No Trace curriculum is it may be the only thing that all 4 of the principal land management agencies in America have ever agreed on. And so it is a curriculum that you'll see when you're traveling within the BLM lands, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, and the Forest Service. They've all agreed to promote it, and so you'll see their signage, you'll see that on the permits, and so it's something that is uniform throughout federally managed lands. So now just a brief introduction to some of the principles. The first one is plan ahead and prepare, and I think of it as the foundational principle because it really is, or I should say the other 6 principles are completely dependent on plan ahead and prepare. So some of the things I was reflecting on that might be relevant to traditional winter travel would be this. If we're planning a trip and we're planning to take a tent that requires a wooden superstructure to be cut in the backcountry, and we plan to bring a stove and use fuel, do we know enough about the forest and its health to be able to be sure that the forest can sustain that kind of impact, particularly if it's more than just our trip that's happening that year? So doing a little research into the sustainability of the forest that we're traveling through. Another thing might be, is there adequate snowpack? Are there going to be patches of vulnerable vegetation, mosses, perhaps elements of tundra if the snowpack hasn't been good? And that's increasingly a concern as the years go by for us. And then also a bit more of a personal concern in the sense of, even in relatively flat travel, I was looking on a map actually of this place, we've got some avalanche potential slopes within a couple of miles of our location right here. That is, the angle's large enough that enough snowpack built and there was a trigger, it could slide. So if we were part of an accident, rescues tend to be one of the most devastating impacts that a backcountry environment has because people are obviously in a hurry to preserve human life, and so less consideration happens to the impacts that occur to the biotic and social communities that they travel through. So these are just a few. There certainly would be more as we try to make application to the principles. The second principle is travel and camp on durable surfaces, and I don't have a lot to say. Winter camping is probably the best option for traveling and camping on durable surfaces because it's a surface that disappears with the cycle of the season. So the impact we do make, or much of it anyway, is dissipated simply through the thaw and melt cycles. Now here's going to be a bit of a controversial one. Dispose of waste properly. So I think if we think in terms of 3 waste streams, food, fuel, and feces, these are some places where we could possibly, if we were committed to it and thought it necessary, inch ourselves towards less impact. So let's take them in turn. And we think in terms of food. We're particularly thinking about the impact of the waste food that we leave. We cook too much food, what do we do with it? It'd be very easy to throw that outside the tent or leave it or scatter it, but in a winter environment, it's essentially putting it in the freezer. So it preserves. As it melts, of course, it comes down, and then it's just deposited on the surface of the ground. Animals come in and begin to get habituated to human food. Now, some of the very remote places, upwards in Labrador and the Arctic, this may be less of a concern, But I've seen already in just my 24 hours here, a significant number of us are traveling in the lower 48 and doing these trips where the populations to these backcountry areas are much higher. So I think what we do with our food and its waste and its effect on the habituation of animals is significant. These are known problems in many of our state parks and in our national parks already. An amazing amount of resources going and a lot of devastation to relocated and exterminated animals because of our practices. We think of fuel. What do we do with the leftover ashes from the campfire, from the stove? What do we do with the half-burned pieces because it was just so cold in the morning that we couldn't quite face it without another fire in the tent, and it only half-burned or a third burnt? This really has to do, I think, more with a social impact. I don't think scientists are suggesting there'd be anything devastating with a concentration of charcoal that just dropped down and was deposited. It's more the social impact of another hiker coming in the summer and seeing that there's this residue of charcoal and that someone relatively recently has been there. So the recommendation to lessen the social impact is simply to scatter that which it is, so that a hiker came through, they wouldn't be confronted with a campfire, essentially, that someone had that just surface deposited onto the ground through the melt, but that it's likely that they wouldn't even encounter many of the pieces at all. Of course, the black on the snow is going to absorb much more radiation. It's going to melt out quicker and create some type of a bizarre shape in the snow that could have another social impact. I think I'm not alone in a major reason that I do pursue wilderness travel in the winter is for the solitude, to experience a landscape, to use our Wilderness Act that's been untrammeled. And so to see that kind of impact somewhat needlessly does impinge on my experience. It may not be the majority of us that feel that way, but there's certainly a contingent that do. And here's the controversial one. So as I understand it, it's somewhat common to do some type of a fecal burial in the snow and then have that simply melt down. It would become a surface deposit. The literature I've seen does suggest be mindful of where you make your fecal deposit because that's ultimately going to enter our water system. In an alpine environment, and you'll have to tell me whether this is a sell for this community or not, but there's a variety of disposable toilets that we essentially use. They have some type of an active ingredient that is bactericidal, so it kills any of the bacteria that's in the feces, so that when you get to town, this bag can actually be thrown in any regular trash without becoming a biohazard to our people collecting the trash. And so this is a particularly helpful one for those that don't like to squat. You literally tie it on. This is a real photograph from the Biffy bag. And so I think it says a Biffy in a jiffy is what they call it. And so you tie it on literally, you pull it through your crotch, and so there's not really much aim involved. It's essentially a funnel that comes down. Sorry to be so crude this morning right after breakfast. And it deposits in the bag. Not to be too grotesque, but you can have multiple deposits in the bag if you fold it down very carefully. And so this creates a relatively small package on your toboggan. It doesn't weigh, probably a half pound a day at the most. And so for week to 2 week trips, it might be a reasonable thing. It will be frozen, so we're not dealing with the scent. A lot of parks require this in the summertime for users in warmer environments where scent is an issue. So I think it's less of a sacrifice for us, although, granted, it's more to pull. So that's, I think, where some of the ethic comes in. Is it something we'd be willing to do to bring that fecal material out of the backcountry and have it in a more benign environment? You're welcome to look at my Biffy bag later if you'd like. I haven't used it. Leave what you find, and then the implication for this principle is the following, and leave it as much as you can as you found it. A bit of a grammatical mouthful. But these are the stumps left by the Donner Party, mid-1800s. And so you get an inclination of what the snowpack was like. So as far as leave what you find, one of the things that I think we could be more cognizant of, and again, inching our way towards less impact, would be looking for places to cut the trees that we'll use for our fuel and the superstructures of our tent in places where the snowpack might be a little bit lower. Or dare I even suggest bringing the shovel out and maybe going down a couple of feet before we cut, just for those that come after us, so they're not encountering stumps that are waist or neck high. There are places, certainly in our forests, where the wind has come in that direction. It's scoured out the snowpack on sides of small hills where there is less snow there. Maybe we could be a little bit more mindful of where we cut so that we don't leave this kind of curious artifact after. This might be the most contentious one. I think it's unfortunate that a lot of people read no campfires, and that's not really what it says. It's saying minimize the impacts of your campfire. For some alpine groups, the application is to take a stove, as in a whisper-light cooking stove, as an alternative to having a campfire, so you don't have to cook on the campfire. But I think there's ways that we can be sensitive with this as traditional winter travelers and still very much honor the scientific principle. And so I don't know if any of you get Forest Service permits to cut your Christmas trees. Does anybody do that? Oh, no. So it's cheap. It's, $8 to $10. You get a Forest Service permit. You go into and you cut a wild tree that's never been groomed before. So it's nice to have this other species in the house that hasn't been completely perfect. But the Forest Service, the reason I'm bringing this up is they give a number of suggestions on how to do that so as to make the forest healthier by taking the tree out. So there's just minimum specifications, like try to cut something that's less than 6 inches, so it hasn't really established itself as a dominant tree in the area. Try to find something that's being shaded by a larger tree so that it's essentially in competition with the tree that's already thriving and simply taking nutrients away from it. So what I'm suggesting is I think there's ways we could more consciously cut the tree so as to, over time, increase the health of the forest if we're mindful of where we're cutting. Other maybe more obvious things to think about would be taking only that which we need. Might be a temptation to bank a huge amount of firewood to make sure we don't run out. What do we do with the wood that we've cut? Do we carry it the next day or not? Perhaps if it's a little bit of wood that we misjudged and cut extra, we could consider carrying that for the day's journey. If the forest looks fragile, we're not particularly sure on its health, the numbers are in decline, we see that there's blights, maybe instead of committing to being able to wear a t-shirt at minus 20 in the tent, we could think in terms of being comfortable with a wool sweater on instead. So therefore using a little bit less fuel. So again, we're not saying no campfires. That's an incredible part of our connection to the natural world. But could we be a little bit more thoughtful in how we approach it? Respecting wildlife. So as far as the megafauna go, the big exciting animals that we get to see, they're essentially going calorie negative every day of the winter. They're depending on their fat stores to get them through because it's so challenging to forage. If you're like me, it's so exciting to see these wild animals that I want to be in their presence. I simply want to be near to them. And so whether it's motivation for camera or whether it's just motivation to share a pristine moment, we have this draw to be near them. However, if we encroach on their personal space, that will often frighten, and they put out more calories to try to secure what they think would be their safety, even though we have no intent to hurt them. So we exacerbate the caloric deficit that's already happening for them. So the suggestion here is that we be mindful of how close we're getting, and then bring a light tool. So I have a little 10 by 25 Zeiss monocular. It's high-quality optics. It's crystal clear. And at 10 by 25, I can pull in from a distance and enjoy these megafauna without having to encroach on their personal space. So it's a small weight sacrifice for me, but I'm pleased to suffer that for the sake of making sure I'm not going to exacerbate the caloric deficit for these lovely animals. The last principle is to be considerate of other visitors. So since many of us do go to wild environments to have a pristine and untouched experience, I think we can be mindful of the impacts that we make with our imprints and with our ashes from our fire, and doing that away from the trail. So even going an extra 30 meters or 50 meters from the trail would allow us to not make that impact, which inevitably happens when we camp, so that others, if they're not camping in that area, go through and they don't seem to notice that other people have been camping or even are camping at that time as they pass through. As we suggested, you could disperse the leftover wood that you have or that you've burned, and then possibly consider carrying if there's a little bit that you've cut that you could reuse the next evening. The way I think of this is that essentially I'm a caretaker of that place for the next people that visit it. And when I think of it that way, I feel a lot more motivation to want those people that will follow me, even though I'll never meet them, to have that beautiful interaction with the land that they also love. So in conclusion, I want to congratulate you. You're all recipients of an LNT certificate in Awareness Workshop. And then I didn't realize I'd be presenting to the entire population here. So they have tags for all the specific disciplines, whether it's climbing, backpacking, horseback riding, that are plastic, made of reusable or recycled plastic, that they recommend people putting on their kit to remind them of the Leave No Trace principles. I have about 20 of those, and I brought the winter-specific one. They used white, so it's not, it kind of blends in, so to speak, with the landscape. It's not intrusive in that way. So I'll put them out on the table. If anyone would like one, you're very welcome to have it. Wendy, I'm not sure if I have time for questions, but these are my contact details. If it would be helpful to further the discussion at all by phone or email, I'd be glad to do that. And then if I do have time, I'm happy to open it up to questions, comments, or critiques. Okay? Yes? Yeah. Yes. I think that's just an excellent question. As far as a Leave No Trace perspective on that, I think it would be looked at as an indigenous usage in that way. It's not as much of an impact because the population of folks using dogs in those wild areas is much less. So in the same way that while hiking you'll encounter horse species, and no one really challenges that, I think within the LNT community, it's kind of accepted that that would be an outcome naturally for animals. I don't know of people hiking out dog feces from Arctic and northern environments. John, have you heard of people doing that with dog feces? Not sled dog feces. Certainly a dog in a hike, it's not even allowed in a national park, but we would hike it out. But I've never heard of that. I think it's just a natural outcome of a natural process with that species. You'd probably argue, well, why isn't it for us? I understand that tension. Yeah. Yeah. So the reason was to try to concentrate. So I didn't get into this, but where a lot of people will be going, we try to concentrate use from an LNT perspective because it doesn't take very many impacts before the land is almost irreparably impacted, or at least for a long time. So the shelter system brings folks to a limited surface area that's already been impacted and continues to concentrate the use there with the idea that the surrounding lands would continue to be able to sustainably regenerate themselves because there's less impact happening. So the argument is concentrate usage and then over pristine areas disperse usage. So that's at least the philosophy. For many of us, it's too much of a social impact. We're not excited about camping with 10 people that we don't know when we go out. And that's why I think the Leave No Trace principles are so helpful, because if we do choose to be on pristine land, there are things we can do to minimize our impacts, which allow those pristine lands to regenerate far quicker after we've traveled through them. Don't know if does that get at some of the motivation? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.